Hello, my name is John. I'm a full stack software engineer, and I wanted to go through a fun little coding exercise that would be maybe a little bit useful for anyone learning to program on the front end or even trying to build their resume to get their first job. So, the way I've organized this is kind of like a feature that you might develop at work, where they give you something they need built, and your job is to work with the back end to get the data and then display it in whatever way they tell you to. So, who's this targeted for? People with maybe a little bit of coding experience, or just someone who's trying to brush up on some of these tools. The main tools I'll be using are React, Axios for the AJAX calls, and SAS or SCSS for the styling. I'll also cover React hooks as a tool. So this is the app that I built, the sample app. Essentially, all you're doing is searching the name of a Pokemon, and it's displaying it in the Pokedex. So if I search Pikachu, it's going to display little Pikachu with some facts about Pikachu. So how we'll do this is start by going to React, and you could just Google React, create React app. That's the tool I'll be using just because it's the easiest way to get things up and going. Just scroll down until you see npm create React app. You'll probably have to install it if you don't have that installed yet, but that's pretty straightforward. If you just Google it, you'll see it's pretty simple. Now I'm on my desktop here, and I'm going to run that command. Or instead of my app, I'm saying Pokedex. And that's just going to go through the installer, create the React app with all of its dependencies, and we are done. So if I just list off, I'll go into the Pokedex, and VS Code is what I'm using. You could use Atom or Sublime or whatever text editor you want, but I'm going to open, and I put this in my desktop. So the first thing I'll do is say yarn start just to get it running, and you get your basic create React app, which everything that you see here is going to be in this source directory. Now, if I go to app here, delete everything out of this. Don't need that. And like I said, we're going to use SCSS instead of CSS, so I'm going to change that to CSS here. I'll change that to SCSS. Now the problem you're going to run into is by default, React app isn't configured to use SCSS, and that can be easily resolved, but just by saying yarn add, I believe it's node sass. Boom. And that's done. So I will yarn start again. We are in an empty app because I deleted everything out. But if I say test, you'll see test right there. And so here, app, I'm just going to clear everything out. Yeah, so we should be good with that. Now, another thing I'm going to use for styling, it's called the BEM model block element modifier. And that's just a methodology, an approach to styling that a lot of companies use. Pretty much every company I've worked at, we've implemented that just because when you're on a team of developers, it's good to have a set of rules that everyone abides by. So essentially how this works is a given area is going to be a block. Something inside of that is going to be an element. So like here you have menu, and then in that menu, you're going to have these items here. You're going to have an input. You're going to have a logo. But obviously, not every menu item might always look the same. For example, if you wanted to bold blog, then you would modify that. So if I click up here on naming, I can find examples where you have your block, and then elements are underscore underscore and then the name of that element. And if I scroll down, a modifier is going to be dash dash modifier. This might sound a little confusing, but I'll show you how that looks in the code, and hopefully it'll make a lot of sense right away. So the first thing I'm actually going to do is I'm going to create a div tag that is my container for all of the content. And here, I'm just going to actually underscore this, or lowercase this, and say app underscore underscore container. And that's because this container is an element in the app. So here, this is the SCSS part, where instead of going here and saying app container and creating that below, I can actually just take the container part, say and throw that right here. Now here, if I said the background color were black and the container background color white with a width of 80%, min height 100, view height, we just have to say app here, min height also. Oops. Class name, there we go. And that gives us a container. Obviously, we want that in the middle, margin auto, or you could use Flexbox. Now, one thing I like to do across an app, it's nice to have variables that are consistent throughout. So if I'm defining colors, then I can just import that variables file wherever I need it and access those variables. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new folder, global styles as the directory, and then I'll create a new file, and that'll be underscore variables .scss. And here's where I'll actually define all of the colors that I want. And what I like to do in general is, before I even start, just have some specific values that are a standard convention I go by, just so that I know exactly if I'm looking for basic things that I might put in all of my projects. And so for me, I'll always put in blacks, whites, and grays first. So I'll put black 01 is always going to be genuine black. Same thing with white, and that's going to be completely white. By the way, I'm also just alphabetizing all of this. I like to make sure that if you're going to quickly go to a file, functions and stuff like that are generally alphabetized so that there's a better code readability, I guess. And gray, I'll usually go dark to light, except for white, then I'll go light to darker. So in this case, gray, I'm going to say 444. And then I'll just go by 2s up through gray to 6. So 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Now this 4, 4, 4, like I said, 2s. So 6, 6, 6, DC. And then gray 6, I've played around with in the past, and I've settled on E8. And then white, I like to have just a somewhat of a off-white color, and I've settled on F0. It just allows me to give something that's a little less stark than raw white. Now, the other colors that I'm going to want are a green, a yellow, and the red. And the reason for that is I looked up Pokedex. And so, say in a given job, they might give you a mock-up depending on the company you're at. Those mock-ups might be high fidelity or general sketches. That it just all depends. In this case, let's say I'm given something like this, just something basic. So I look at this here, and then red, yellow, green, I'm going to want. So I might decide those beforehand, or maybe once you get into it, you'll add them later. But I've already kind of picked them out. So I'll just add them in, and you can copy them over. So we've got black, our grays, and then our green, red, and yellow available. And I can do this now here by saying background color. I don't want to go for something so dark. So what I'll do is say that gray 6 as the background for the app, and then the container 1 to start. So if you go right away, you're going to find that it's yelling at you. And the reason for that is you haven't actually imported it into the file, which is easy by just saying at import, and our directory is global styles variables .scss, and that's where you see it's a SAS convention to underscore the file, and then when you import it, you don't have to include that underscore or the .scss part. So that's just right there. And when I save it now, you'll see, boom, we've got this nice little container. And what I'm probably going to do is set width here. I'll set a max width, say 900 pixels, so that if the screen gets really, really big, you're not stretching everything out ridiculously far. Now, what do we need? We're going to first want our header, just titling what we have. We're going to have then your search section and your Pokedex. So to start out with the header, in my app container, I will create an h1, and that class is going to be app. We'll call it title. Save that up. And that's what it looks like without any styling on it. So what I think I want is on my container, I think I want a padding of, say, 15 pixels. And now a different element of this app is going to be the title here. And all I'm going to do off the bat is just give it a softer black color. Oops. Black 2. And I don't know if I must have forgotten to give it that black 2. And the one I normally go with is 1.8. And here you see the color 1.8, 1.8, 1.8. It's just a little softer. I like the look of it better. Now, the next portion we're going to do is the search container. So what I like to do is create a new directory for each new, I guess you could call it a block now. And that would just be saying new folder, search.js. And while I'm at it, I generally will just create that search.scss. And I'll just copy this over here. We're still importing React. This is now search app is becoming search. One thing I will change, it's just a personal preference thing. Instead of a function, I like to define this as a constant. So search set to, and that's just using an arrow function instead of the function. But you could use the function search and then just pass in the props as the argument if you wanted. Here I will say search, let's display this as flex, and that's all I'll need for the start. Just to get some quick values in here, input tag, and the submit button. For class name, search underscore button. As for the input, that's our search input. Now, if we want to see that, obviously, it's not going to be there yet. What we have to do is go to our app and import search from our search. I like to separate the React imports from the styling import. But under here, now we can just say search, and we should see our value, or our output. It's obviously not the most pretty, so we can fix that up. So we have our button and our input. What I'll do is I'll give both of these a border radius of 5 pixels. This button, I'm going to want to use colors, so I will import global styles, variables, background color. I'm going to go actually with the red, and then the color itself. This input flex 1, and that means it will go wide. It's obviously very, very ugly. I think everything should be a little taller, and this input should have a margin to its right of 8 pixels or so. So let's get this to around, say, 35 pixels with a font size of, yeah, we'll start with 22. See how that looks. A little nicer. I want a font weight of bold here, and I think I'll go with that same font size. Good. That should be good enough. I think I actually want the pure white for our color here. Yeah, I like that more. And if you click that, nothing happens yet because we have not configured the component to do anything. For that, I'm actually going to make this a form and say on submit, and that takes an event and does something. So right now, I could log test. I don't know if, yep, so you could see if you look at this console here, the problem is it shows you test, but then it's reloading the page because forms by default are submitting the contents from that form, and we obviously don't want that. And so this event gives us the ability to say event.prevent default, and that's just stopping the page reload, or for that matter, anything that the form is going to do by default. So now if I say something, it's going to log that test. Now, how do we get the value from the input? I think the best way to do that is by using React hooks, and in this case, the use state hook. And how that works is you define a value and its setter that can be used anywhere that you pass it. So in our case, you create a constant of input value, or in this case, we're going to say Pokemon name value, or the variable that we'll be able to access. And then you define the setter. So set Pokemon name. And by convention, you're basically always going to say set, and then whatever this is, but obviously you're camel casing it. So that's saying use state, and here is the initial value, which is going to be nothing. One thing I think I'll also add here is a placeholder of search Pokemon, and the value is Pokemon name. So for example, if the default name were Pikachu, you go here and you've got Pikachu. Now, the reason it's yelling is that right now, if I'm typing, it's not changing. And the reason is this value is locked to whatever Pokemon name is, but there's no way to actually change that yet. So the easy way to handle that is on change through the input. So anytime that value is changing, you're going to take the event and you're going to say set Pokemon name to event.target.value. And that's basically just taking the value of whatever's entered and setting it to set Pokemon. So when a change has been triggered, you're setting the Pokemon name to whatever it wants it to go to. This Pokemon name then goes to the value. And a good way that you could show that it allows you basically to control the input. For example, I can go here and just take this variable and say test. And what that, every time I press something, it's going to add test to the end of it. That's just a demonstration that this gives you a lot of flexibility in terms of determining what goes in there. But essentially, this just gives us the control now over Pokemon name. And here, now when we're saying on our submit, we can just print out Pokemon name. Pikachu, go find them all. Good. So what we have to do now is get the value or get the data for our Pokedex. And Pokemon Poke.api.co is this cool free source of Pokemon data that you can access to get all sorts of random information about a Pokemon. And the reason I chose this is because it's free, it's easy to use, and the idea is it's simulating, say, a front-end developer who's finishing something that a back-end dev started. And so let's say I'm working on a team where the back-end dev already created the endpoint and tells me, these are the inputs, this is how you get the data, take it from here. I now have the documentation to go in and finish that task up. So in our case, we're taking this as our base URL. So we'll say const base URL. And in our case, since we are always going to be just looking for specific Pokemon data, we can say Pokemon here / Pokemon. And now the name of our Pokemon is going to go here. So like it was showing Pikachu. And the way we will do that is by utilizing this library called Axios, which is just a simple little library that helps make fetch calls. For that, obviously, we're going to have to import it. So yarn add Axios. And that finished up. So as soon as we start that up again, yep, and it's gone. And now it's just yelling at us for not using it, although we have defined it. So the two main ways that you're actually going to use this are either by promises or await async, axios.get, and then our URL. So obviously, we're not going to use our base URL directly, but say that's all we needed for the call. We could either do that and then say then, and that would take our response.catch, which takes an error, and just handle our response that way. And that's fine. I like to use the newer async await, which is basically saying that this is going to be handled in a way that I guess looks a little more synchronous. And what you have to do then is throw in try catch blocks. We'll say our response is going to await whatever Axios provides us, and catch only gets run if there's an error. So we could say error, the error. Now the only thing we have to add to this is this base URL needs the name of the current Pokemon that we're searching. So the const get URL is going to be a base URL plus the name of the Pokemon name. If you're not sure what I'm doing here with this string, it's called a string literal. It essentially allows you to add variables inside of the string as opposed to saying plus and concatenating the two strings. So it's essentially syntactic sugar that just makes things look a little more pleasant. And now this get URL should make the search. Now everything should be in place to say go find them all. And down here in our log, status 200 is always good. And data is giving us all of the information. So here you see name Pikachu, order 35, weight. Sprites are going to be images of the Pikachu, stats, all that sorts of stuff. So that's cool. Essentially, all we need to do now is clean up use state. I don't want to start it with a name. So that's good. But what we're left with is the need to get this data to the rest of the app. And there are all sorts of ways you could do that. But what we want to do is limit the number of different moving pieces. I don't want to bring in a global state management library like MobX, but rather just use what we have, which is React hooks, to handle something very easily. So what I'm going to do is go up into this app and say React use state and say const set search response. And by default, there's no value. And now search, all we need to do is pass it our, say, set data property, which is going to be this set search response. And in our search, what we can do is we can say props.set data, and we want to say response.data. And obviously, if we get a bad response, I'm going to set that data to an object where I'm now getting to determine what gets passed back up to the app. So I will say success false. And then I just want to pass also the name of the Pokemon so that we can reiterate the name that failed the search. Good. Now, what we want to build out next is the Pokedex. And that's going to be the vehicle that we use to display all of the information. So I'll create a new folder. All right, so yeah, create Pokedex here. I'm just going to, again, steal just from our app, const Pokedex, just taking this arrow function. We'll also create our SCSS file so that we can import that, and we do not need our search. Save that up. In our app, we can then include our Pokedex. And we're going to want to obviously pass our data, which is our search response. And boom, the file is properly included. I'm just going to go into this search CSS and say margin bottom of, say, 25 pixels, just to give us some room. Good. Now there are plenty of different ways you could go about making this Pokedex. I'm just going to use flex box for that styling and make a rough set of containers that you could do in a number of different ways, like I said, but obviously this tutorial isn't all about how to get pixel perfect accuracy. I want it to look good enough that it's not an eyesore, but the main idea is to get the functionality working correctly. So for that, our Pokedex is going to be, this Pokedex container is going to be our full container of everything, and this is going to be my new element. So I'll divide this out into a couple different containers for each one of these sides. And obviously they're going to be different heights and all of that. So I need to modify at least one of them. You could break it into, say, Pokedex container left and Pokedex container right. But I think what I'll probably do is just say Pokedex container right, and anything that's in the left that I don't want in the right, I'll just undo there or specify differently. So our Pokedex container, and then here is my right. Pokedex itself, display flex. For now, container, both of my containers are going to have a background color of red. And that red is not going to work unless I import my variables. So I'll start out by saying height 700 pixels, width of 50%, so that they're both going to take up half of their space in the container. And then on the right, I'm going to say my height is a little bit less at, say, 600 pixels. And we can check that out. Oh, oops, I defined that as a variable and not as background color. So here, that is very big. I'm going to shrink it down a little bit to, say, 550 and 450. But obviously, it's looking a little wonky, and we can fix that by saying we will align our items flex end, which is basically going to say both of them go to the bottom. And in that case, since the height is determined by the tallest element, the right side just drops down and the left side stays the same. So the next thing I'm going to do is play around with this top part here. I'll just create a top portion that is two different divs divided out. And I'll just make them a slightly different color to highlight that. So if I go to my Pokedex top, I'm going to say a height of 150 pixels, again, a width of 50%, background color of red 2 now, and let's clear some of this stuff out. Search we don't need. That will be in our left container. So that'll be Pokedex top. And this one will be modified to the right. So like that. Right. So here I forgot to mark our container as display flex. There we go. And to modify our final element, I'm going to say height of 80 pixels. Now all we need to do is add our little balls, circle, lights in each. So in my top, there's going to be another element, and that is camera. This camera is going to be a height 80 pixels with a width of 80 pixels. Background color of gray 4. And what that's going to give us once we add it in, of course, is just going to be a box to start. Oops. Finally, our top, we want to make sure that we are also displaying flex, which makes that a very ugly camera. So to clean that up, we will say align items, center, justify content, center. And to make that camera round, all we have to do is say border radius at 50%. And that places it right there. I'm actually going to make this a lighter and give it a border of 8 pixels, solid and gray 2, just like that. As for the dots on the top right, the only thing we're going to do differently is they're not going to end up in the center. They will be justified to the left. So justify content, flex, start. And I will create little dots with a height of, say, 25 pixels, width 25 pixels, border radius of 50%. And as for the color, that's going to be all modified. So I will create modifier elements for red, green, and yellow. And the only thing that's going to change here is the background color. So background color, green. And then we just have to go into our Pokedex, and here in this right, span class name, Pokedex dot. And in each case, we have our dot red, yellow, just like that. We'll do a little cleanup on that by saying a border of 4 pixels, solid gray 2, and a margin right of 6 pixels. I'm going to soften those borders up just a touch and shrink them down a bit. A little more. Now all we need on the left side is our screen. And actually, while I'm at it, I'm just going to take this left container, or this right container, and say border left is 4 pixels, solid gray, we'll say 3. Thinner than that might be nice, and we'll soften it up just a touch. So that just gives us a defined line of the two sides. Now what we're going to do is we're going to throw a container for the camera or the screen, which will essentially take up the rest of the space, and then the screen itself will take up a portion of the inside of that, justified in the center, vertically and horizontally. So what that will look like is while we're still inside of this container, I'm going to create a div class name Pokedex image container. And in it, at least in the meantime, we'll just put our Pokedex image. So image container. Now our image container is going to be a width of 100% and a height of 100%. But the problem with that is if we say 100%, it's going to calculate out 100% of its parent, which there's not room for, so it'll end up kicking downward. And so all I'm going to do to resolve that easily is just say this height is a calculated value of 100% minus the value of that top, which is 150 pixels. But since I might want to play around with that specific value later, I'll throw that into a variable here. I don't need it to be a global variable. I'll just say top PD height 150 pixels. So the height here of this top is going to be that value. And since SCSS can be a little weird about throwing a variable inside that calc, I don't think that would actually work right there. What I need to do on this is, I believe, if I remember correctly, it is pound and then these curly brackets. Now, it still actually isn't going to work correctly because I need my container, which is holding everything, to be a flex wrap of wrap. Oops. There we go. So as long as this value here, we've got our height of this image container, and we could test this by saying background color gray. Oh. So once we fix this image container, so I had this named wrong, image container, and I need to add the correct variable name, which is $sign top PD height. And you can see here that gives us the proper size of that image container. I don't actually want the background to be gray. Now inside of here, I'm just going to display flex, align item center, justify content center. And our image for now, I'll just hard code it, say 250 pixels for both our height and width, with the background color of black 250. Good. And that's going to be our screen. As for the right side, I'm just going to give it this basic green information screen. So that's our image. Our right side is just going to have class name, a screen. So all we have to do on our container right, we're already displaying flex. We just want to say align item center, justify content center, and I think I'll also throw a padding of just say 20 pixels. And here we will say screen with a flex of 1 to give us max width, height 100%, and background color will be green 01. I'm just going to soften that up with a border radius of 8 pixels and maybe up that padding a little bit. Good. So here now we have our Pokedex created and Pokedex search. What we need to do is plug in the data to the Pokedex and allow us to start viewing the information that we found in our search. The first thing we need for that, obviously, is the data itself. So if we go to our app, you see we're already passing data to our Pokedex, which means here we can say log props.data. Save that here. Right off the bat, you see it's undefined, but when we search Pikachu, all the information that we need. I will start out first by just defining this as props.data so that we can just refer to it as data throughout the component without needing to say props.data everywhere. Now for the image, because that'll be the easiest, I'm actually going to define that up before the return and say Pokemon image. And the reason I'm doing that here is for the readability of this ternary operator, where I'm saying data dot sprites. So be clear, in our data, we have our sprites and then all of these different images. All I want is this front default just because I think that's probably going to be in all of them. It should be just the standard picture that you would expect. So I'll say data.sprites, if that exists, and data.sprites.frontDefault. So if both of these exist, then what I want to do is return an image with the source of data.sprites.frontend or front default. Otherwise, just return essentially this div image here, where it's going to be that black background. And we don't want to forget our alt tag. And just say Pokemon. So this is going to run through every time the Pokedex is rendered. It's going to say, do we have sprites? In that list of sprites, do we have front default? If we do, make Pokemon image this image tag. Otherwise, just make it that black image. So here we can say Pokemon image, save that up. Cannot read property sprites of undefined. That's right. So it could be the case that data is not undefined, not defined at all. In that case, props.data, or I'm just going to pass it an empty object. So if props.data doesn't exist, just make data an empty object so we can at least look for attributes, and those will be undefined. And here we see that black image. Now if we search Pikachu, we get little Pikachu. Oops, that's right. So I forgot that we want this class name regardless. Save that up. Pikachu. And we get our little bugger. Spell the name wrong. There's going to be no data. And bye-bye Pikachu. Good. Now we want to take a similar approach to rendering information on the right side of the screen, or the right screen for that matter. I will do that by actually just creating a separate component for screen information. So I'll go constant screen, set to props, arrow function. We will return our information. Again, I will say constant data is set to props.data, and that will be either this props.data or it'll just be an empty object. Here in this screen, I can now say screen data will be data div test, and we got our test right there. Now, just for simplicity, in here in our screen, all I'm going to really do is add a padding of, say, 15 pixels. We're going to display this flex, and we are going to flex direction column, which means instead of everything going left to right, it'll go top to bottom, so that each element that we add is going top to bottom. The reason that padding just changed the height has to do with the box style. So for example, if I go in here and I say box sizing, border box, that means your height is going to be determined by what you say the height is instead of the height, what you say it is, plus the padding. So all we have to do for that is say box sizing, border box. Save that up, and we are good with our padding and all. So let's go to our screen now, and in here I'm going to define a function that's called getAttribute, and that's going to be used in here for each individual attribute that we want. So let's say Choo. Instead of defining out everything, like, for example, data.name, we could very well just say name, throw that in its own little row. We could define everything out one at a time. Name, ID, all of that. What I'm going to do is create a class called Pokedex screen row. And then in that, each row is going to have a key or a title as well as a value. So here, I'll say class Pokedex screen key for the name of that key, and then a screen value. So in this case, we might say ID is going to be that data.id, class name. And off the bat, there's nothing. And there it is. So let's get this styled. Actually, before I do that, I just want to throw in another row here. And what we're going to put right away is nice, big, and bolded, the name of the Pokemon. So we'll say H4, screen, and here we'll say screen title. And something that's good to keep in mind, it shouldn't be saying undefined if no Pokemon has been searched yet. So again, we're going to say data.name. If that exists, then give us data.name. Otherwise, don't render anything. There we go. New. And before we continue, I just want to get all these things styled out. So we've got our screen row, screen title, screen key, and screen value. Again, these are all alphabetized, so that's why I'm jumping all over the place. Now, I do want to say it's worth keeping in mind, I'm putting all of this in one file just for simplicity, or I should say in one element for simplicity. This is all going in the Pokedex. What you're probably going to want to actually do if you're taking more time and delivering this in a professional way is this should all be different blocks altogether. So this screen should probably be its own block, where instead of Pokedex screen row or screen key, this should just be probably screen, and then inside of a screen you have a title or a row. But like I said, for simplicity, I'm just throwing this all in Pokedex so that I don't have to keep jumping around in different files just to speed things up. But it is worth keeping in mind that if you're working on a team, you're going to want to divide things out a little better. So my screen title, I'm going to say margin top 0. I'll keep that margin bottom actually. My rows, I want a margin bottom of 8 pixels, 5 pixels. My screen key, I want to say font weight bold, at least to start. And we'll see if we even actually add anything for this value. Key, I'm also going to add margin right of 8 pixels. Font size of 24 pixels. Good, but I don't think I want that much of a distance between. Oh, that's right, because I'm in a row here. I don't need a row around this header. Yep, and then I'll cut this margin to say 12 pixels. I think that looks good. So screen title, margin top, margin bottom, 12 pixels. Good. So instead of, like I said before, instead of, first of all, having all of these keys that I'm going to write out be just sitting there and determine variably if I want to render them, what I'm going to do is just write this get attribute function for each individual attribute that I want so that I can display the values. And if I change something about one, I don't have to go into all of them and keep changing. So this row is actually going to be here. And this function, I just actually want parentheses because I don't have to write a return value. Oh shit, yeah, that's right, it's a function. Const get attribute set to, and then parentheses means you're automatically returning, whereas I could add curly brackets and then a return value if I wanted to do more complex things before actually returning. So what I'm going to take is the key, the name I want to be. I'll start with just that. So what I'll do here is I'll say name is going to go here, data, key, and that'll give us the value. And here, get attribute. So the first thing I want is the ID, and we'll just say ID mu. That's working. But obviously I don't want to say ID unless there's actually a value to show. So now I'm actually going to do what I probably should have done off the bat, which is to make this a return value. And if data of the key does not exist, so if not data of the key, just return null. And that's going to say, show us nothing right off the start. And until there's an actual value, then it'll display. And that's a good reminder that we should do something similar up here. What I'm going to want to do here actually is go into my search, and in this response here, instead of returning just the data, I will return all of the data. So ... inside of this object ... means I'm returning all of the response data in that one object, as well as whatever else I put here. So I can put success, true. And now here in the Pokedex, if data.success and data.name. So if I say mu, me, nothing. Sweet. So what else can we add for data? Well, what we see right around here in the first layer would be weight as well as height, I think. Yep. So let's get our attributes for weight and then height. Now, inside of here, we've got our title and then all of these. So this div is actually kind of unnecessary because we already have the styling from the screen that's saying to list things off one at a time. So what I can actually do here is instead of this div, I can actually just give it empty tags, and React then knows to just put the contents directly in there, which is kind of cool. Another thing I want to do is make sure that this mu is actually capitalized, and I could either go in JavaScript, find the string, and capitalize the first letter, or I could go over here in my screen title, and I believe it's text transform, yep, capitalize. And that's going to say mu, capitalize, which is cool. What we're missing is the ability to do a couple things. We want to be able to know what kind of measurements these are, and we also want to be able to get more information that's not a direct attribute. For example, what kind of types is this mu? Unit is pretty easy, and that we'll just pass that in as a third argument. So we'll say here the unit for weight, I don't know, I don't know if it's kilograms or what, I'll just say pounds. A height of feet. And now in here, we are taking our argument of unit. And we're saying space. Is there a unit? Then give us that unit. If there's not, nothing. Lit. Okay, so the final thing I want to add is the ability to get some of these deeper lists. What I think I'll do for that is I will just give the ability to specify how you want to get values out of this get attribute. So we will get the text through a function that you can pass. And how I'll do that is the name is going to be passed already. The value is what we're changing. So here I will say if get text exists, then render the result from get text. Otherwise, data key alone. So in the case of all of these, nothing should actually change. But I'll add another one, another attribute. And this time, let's target the abilities. So abilities is going to be a list of abilities with the attribute ability. To do that, right here, we will say abilities. No unit for those. And this is where we're actually going to define our function that takes the result of data.abilities. So actually what I think will help is if I visualize how we're going to play with the array data on the console, just to give you a sense of what's going on, so that when I throw it in, it doesn't look like a bunch of random symbols, but rather something you can understand. So I will define A as an array of 1, 2, 3. Now, what I want to get out of A are those values to render. So what I could do is I could say A dot join. That's right. And now join is going to join everything in there. So 1, 2, 3. In our case, I just want to throw a comma in there and get 1, 2, 3. Unfortunately, these abilities that we have aren't one layer below abilities. It's an array of objects that hold something that says abilities. Now, to get an array from another array that gets some data out of it, we can run what's called a map over that array. So a.map is going to take 1, then 2, then 3 at a time. So we can say our item is 1, then 2, then 3. And in this case, we can just return that item, and that's going to give us an array here. So what if we say A is an array of objects where each object has an ability. So this first one is the push ability. The next one is a pull ability. Oops. And this is going to map. This is going to be more similar to what we have from the Pokemon data, because we have A, say 0 dot ability is push. So now let's look at our abilities one last time and then write out how to render it. We have our abilities, which is an array of objects. And that object then has a name one level deeper. So let's build it. we have our get attribute abilities is this no label, and we're going to get our abilities, and that's simply going to be an array of these abilities. Now, what we want to do is map through those abilities and get the name out of that. So we will return abilities.map and get an ability from there. And that we just want to return our ability dot name. So we're going to run through these, get an ability, return its name, and it's probably still yelling at me because we can't return an array as a response. So again, we're just going to run this join on there. Instead of just returning ability.name, we need to run ability.ability.name. Save it up and run mu. Boom, we've got synchronize. Now on another Pokemon, say Charizard, we've got multiple abilities, and those are separated by our comma space. So that's kind of cool. I think I also want to throw here after this name of the attribute an extra little colon. Good. All right, so I just want to do one more example of writing your own function. And I think I found here species. This is a little different. This isn't an array, but it is nesting a value. So your species and then your name is down there. So what I could do is put here species, and that's going to be, again, no unit. And here you're getting a species, and you need to return the object's name. So here you're returning species.name. And if I did that correctly, boom, your species is a type mu. I don't even know if they're all the same. Species is just the name of the Pokemon. That's silly. But again, it's about getting the data out of the object. You could do the same thing now with moves and render all of these different moves by mapping through getting the move and the name of that move. So I think that's all I want to do today. And you could build in like what I did, I think, in my initial example, where if you search a bad name, that it actually gives you a message. You could put it on the screen. Maybe that's something that would be worth doing on your own, just to practice working with the data. But overall, I think I'm pretty happy with this, just because it should be a good little thing that you could do if you're trying to get better at your JavaScript skills, to work with data. This is kind of, I guess, what would separate front-end developer maybe from a front-end engineer, is working with the back-end to call data, move it around your application, and then render it, as opposed to just being given data that you have to show and make it look a certain way. So if you like this, give it a like. It's my first time doing any kind of tutorial. If you want to see more videos like this, feel free to subscribe, I guess. And if there's any way that you think I could have done a better job, feel free to leave a comment and let me know. And I guess if I do this again, see you next time.